COVID lockdown tomorrow.
Oh my God. I can imagine how much different it must be in Canada than it is in Texas. We've been rebelling against the man for about 4 months now.
I don't know if I ever told you that I went to Texas after having spent time in New York, and I just couldn't believe how nice the people were. And I thought, oh, I'd forgotten that not all Americans are like New Yorkers.
Yeah, they have a reputation for being tough and caustic, and usually Texans are pretty laid back, but we got our share too. I promise you. So I read about half of your book, and it's a mind bender. It really makes you think. You're a cerebral guy. I think this book, you're speaking to yourself here a lot, aren't you?
Yeah, and by the way, are we recording now, or
I
are we
just
going?
started. I'm sorry. Yeah, we're recording. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
we're in. Okay, yeah. So first of all, so you're the first guy I'm talking to about this. So
That makes this an exclusive interview with David Creelman right here. Okay.
it is exclusive, and the yeah. So this book I wrote uh, for people. I call it management for scientists and engineers because it's for people who are maybe a little bit. I hate to say it, but a little bit nerdy. The kind of person who, if you were in a dentist's office and there was a copy of Entertainment This Week and Physics Today, you'd probably say, I'm going to pick up the Physics Today and just see what's going on in the world of physics. Um, so that is kind of what I had in mind, and yeah, I'm definitely the kind of guy who's going to pick up that Physics Today journal, or go to some science lecture at the local university, um, and that kind of informs the tone, but the subject is not science. The subject is management.
Yeah.
And the fun. I mean, I can ask you what your sense of this is, but. Um, I talk to people and I think, so like, are things better now than they were like 20 years ago or 50 years ago? Uh, and people say, I don't think so. We were doing a lot of good stuff in management back then, and it doesn't seem to be any better. And to me, that's a sorry state for if this is your profession, management, and you got all these business schools and so on, and you say, yeah, but actually, we haven't made any significant progress in most of management. That's what I'm interested in thinking about.
Well, I think in premise we agree because you were saying, I mean, this isn't a management tips book. This is a book, like you described it, the science of management, which I think is great because there really isn't much science to management. It seems to be who has a good brand and who has a good message and who can basically recraft maybe what somebody else has said. There's some people who have real good. I love Simon Sinek, for instance.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
there's things that a lot of it's obvious stuff, right? We're talking about human behavior, but the premise of your book that engineers and scientists, that type of thinking, that the kind of management that we're preaching must just drive them insane. They don't understand it because there's no proven evidence based management style. There's no formula.
Yeah, yeah, and it took me the longest time to get used to the world of management. So I'll just give you an example. Is that you have a consultant come in, one of the big consultancies, and they say, okay, we're going to show you a model, and somehow, and this is my own failure, I suppose, but I thought like a model was, I imagine a model of a jet engine, right? And they're gonna show us how all the parts work and how this leads to that, and why this is shaped a certain way for particular reasons. Or if you think of a model from, say, biochemistry, and you think, well, how is vitamin C created in the body? And you've all, this chemical leads to that chemical, and it connects to the other chemical, and it all goes in around a cycle. So it's complicated, it's precise, everything is there for a reason. But the consultant would come up and he'd draw three circles on the whiteboard or something, and say, well, that's my model. And I thought, I'm still waiting for the jet engine model, not the three circles.
I've done the three circles. That tells you how much scientific thought goes into that. I've done that before myself, and you find where they all intersect, and you have the little wedge that is the real key to it. And it was great because in school I got a minor in psychology and another in sociology. That's what happens when you stick around for your bachelor's for about 5.5 years. But I love this type of stuff. You even mentioned one of my favorite guys, Daniel Kahneman. I've done some research on him before when I was it was the probability about it was it was tied to that how human beings perceive loss and how adverse we are to taking a risk versus a sure thing. And I mean, it was fascinating. But you're mentioning him as it relates to dual process theory in here. That's one of the first concepts that grabs you in here.
Yeah, so and I think a lot of people are familiar with the name Kahneman. He's this thinking fast and slow guy, right? And he's done all this great work and all the mistakes that people can make. So let me just talk about him just for a second. Let's imagine if we pull him into the room and we say, okay, here's your task. You've got an organization of 1,000 humans running around, all working together to make important decisions and create some product or service that's going to serve your customers, right? And you could, how easy is that going to be? And he'd think, oh my gosh, from what I know about how humans make decisions, that's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a nightmare. and I think anybody in HR in the audience is going, yeah, you know what? Like, it is pretty bloody hard to manage a bunch of humans. Now, and in fact, it's amazing that we do as well as we do. And the thinking fast and thinking slow paradigm that we've heard about is actually part of sort of a broader way of thinking about how the human brain works, with this they call dual process theory, which is simply means there are two different ways of thinking in the brain, and it shows up in all kinds of different things. And one is the intuitive side versus the analytical side.
We're talking about a left and right brain.
Left and right, yeah.
Yep.
And I think that is a really useful starting point for if we want to understand why it's been so hard to create a science of management, and maybe why engineers find management so hard, is that engineers assume that everybody's working with the analytical left brain. And the dual process theory says, yeah, there's the analytical left brain is going off doing its stuff. Meanwhile, there's the intuitive right brain doing its stuff, and they often don't actually agree very well on what to do.
Well, it's that human side, the soft side, that screws everything up.
Well, what I think that's what Kahneman seems to imply.
Yeah.
But then you go over to this Scottish. I think he's Scottish, Ian McGilchrist. I think that he's certainly British, and so he's a psychiatrist, and he's interested in these kinds of things, the dual process theory, and he says, look, the left analytical engineering brain can get right out of hand as well, because it wants everything to fit in a nice little box. And if you've been in management, so often things just don't fit in neat boxes. And the engineering, IT guys are like this too sometimes, is that, everything looks so nice in their process diagram on their piece of paper. But the reality is different from that neat little flow chart they put on paper. And they get so attached to their flow chart or their little boxes that they lose touch with the complex reality they're dealing with.
Well, that's what breeds careers for people in HR. There's nothing. Well, you can do comp and benefits and things like that, but when you get into the strategic piece of HR, nothing fits neatly. Every employee relations issue has its own unique lifespan. I mean, that's part of what appeals to me about the job. And I know if people are listening and they're in human resources, they're saying, yeah, when does anything ever fit into a box? That's generally where, some of the management classes and the models that are out there, and people get sent to really neat Ivy League executive ed programs and things like that. They're awesome. They're fun. But then you get back and you're in the real world experiment, and all of a sudden things start going wackadoo again.
And that is a very interesting observation. It'd be interesting to know how many people sort of have had that experience where you're so excited with what you've learned at a prestigious university, and then when you get back into the world, something just goes amiss. And to me, that happens all the time. And to me, it's a signal, because those were smart. If you're whether it's a big university or big consultancy or whatever, these are smart people who spend a long time studying this thing. It's not some guy you pulled in off the street, some charlatan. And yet, why is it that even when you get the, theoretically the best possible advice, and then you try to apply it, it doesn't seem to fit? And again, let's imagine you went to engineering school, and you were learning, or military college, you're learning how to fire cannonballs or something, and then you find cannonballs don't actually fly the way they're supposed to fly. You'd be pretty concerned, because you want it to land where it's supposed to land. Or if you're building a building and you're supposed to calculate the strengths of the girders or something, and then they all start bending, you think, I need a better science. I don't want to go study this stuff and then find that when I get to the real world, it actually doesn't work.
Yeah,
and that's
in a controlled environment, and then they throw you out in the wild. It's like you have an animal that you study and you keep it in captivity, and then you go, okay, this is going to help you survive. Here's the jungle, and they get eaten in 2 days.
And I have enormous respect for managers' capability to survive in the wild. It's actually amazing the kind of wisdom and insight you give, or you see people perform. And I don't want to toss out the kind of insight you get from the management books and the academics and so on. I mean, I read all that stuff, and I love all that stuff, and I get good ideas from that stuff. But it's just not like engineering, and it's not clear that the wisdom of advice that we're getting today is any better than the wisdom we were getting 50 years ago. And you think, how are we going to get better as a society if our management can't get any better?
Well, so I'm wondering what was the spark that said, I got to write this book? Because a book like this is a heavy endeavor. Something must have motivated you to say, I got to get this down on paper.
Yeah, well, part of it is that it's been a concern sort of my whole life, as I've always felt like I just don't really know what's going on. that can be my epitaph. Here's a guy who never really figured out what the heck was going on. But besides that, if there was one moment, if there was this guy in Canada, Professor Henry Mintzberg, and he, not everybody knows him. He's one of the sort of most cited management professors in the world. He's quite a funny guy as well. And he's been at it a long time. So I asked him, so I was at one of his events, and I asked him, I said, Henry, has management gotten better over the 50 years you've been working on it? And he goes, oh, no, David, it's gotten much worse. And I think, how can that be, right? How can it be that here we are, and we're all doing our best? So we're doing our best in the practical world. We've got people in university doing their best to research this stuff. And how, given all that, how can it be that he's saying that things are much worse than they were in the past?
So isn't that what you touch on this a little bit? And I was just getting into this part because I'm one of the many people that was interested at one point in getting into industrial organizational psychology.
Yeah.
Isn't that part of that role, is to try to figure out this living beast of a company and figure out what really makes it work? Add a little bit of science to it.
And I have a great fondness for industrial organizational psychologists. By the way, I read one place that a lot of them are underemployed, which is a sad tale of events. But if you look at, and I think fundamentally that's where the best work is happening, and so they're kind of scraping away, trying to build a solid foundation. And I got to toss out some names. So like Denise Rousseau at Carnegie Mellon is great. And by the way, and I mentioned this in the book, but she mentioned it as well. The reason she went into industrial organizational psychology is that her dad was a working man and had rotten bosses, and she thought, like, why do we have rotten bosses? Like, why should it be that way? Like, why should my dad have to come home after a hard days of work made even harder due to bad management? So there's a real human motivation behind that. It's not just intellectual. But these industrial organizational psychologists are trying to apply science. The trouble is, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you just go on to Google Scholar and you're searching for academic papers on something, and you load them up and you try to read them, they're really hard to make any sense of it all. So that's the first problem. I mean, you must have done that back in university where you try to dredge up some academic papers and figure out what they're saying.
Oh man, that would have required some sort of studying or research, and I was not a great student, Dave. I got out by the skin of my teeth. I'm a life learner.
Well, the there are a lot of issues, and so let me tell you sort of the negative side of it, and then I'm going to get to the positive work that people are doing that gives us some hope for the future, right? Like you hope, well, maybe the first 50 years have been a bit rocky, but we're beginning to make traction. And so there's a guy who I've actually worked with, this guy on a couple of his books, Chris Worley, out of he's now I think at Pepperdine. I knew him when he was at the University of Southern California, and one of his colleagues is Phil Mervis and Sue Morman. Okay, so if you know the people at the University of Southern California, you'll have heard a couple of those names. What they say is they say so many, I guess, researchers, the way the reward system works in the universities is you write a relatively trivial paper that's relatively easy for the professors to assess, and that's how you get ahead. If you do something that might really be innovative and provide some deep insights into the field, all the sort of reward systems are stacked against that. And so they're saying there is a kind of research that we can do that is both academically sound and relevant to practice. They call it the sweet spot. So that's an encouraging side. Their book is called How to Do Relevant Research. And so these guys are saying there is a way we can take this work that's going on in academia and make it relevant. So this may not, for you and me, we may not see the benefits of this in our career, but maybe the next generation. Meanwhile, like I mentioned this Denise Rousseau. So she's one of the people who helped found something called the Center of Evidence-Based Management, and that's set in the Netherlands with a guy called Eric Behrens. And what they're trying to do is they're saying, well, we know nobody can read these papers, right? It's just so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the best papers, and we're going to, people talk about a systemic review. So if there's a topic like goal setting or incentives or team size, we're going to look at all the papers on it and we're going to summarize it. And they go one step further in that what they call a rapid evidence review, where they write it in a way that's understandable to a manager. So there is some good work going on in the science, so the real psychology, which is relevant to it is going to be relevant to practice, and it is science-based. Right now, it's pretty thin, and I think a lot of the time you won't find all that much that is actually helpful to what you need to do.
Well, you said you used a term I think most of us are familiar with medicine, evidence-based.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's good. I think that became the go-to term. Is like, this is evidence-based medicine. So, we're doing this based on results and all that. So, if that's the trend in management and what we're learning about it, I think that's certainly a plus.
Yeah, and that is, but that is a positive thing. We should all embrace it. But by the way, the bad news is that when evidence-based became popular, the first thing sort of the management world did is all the consulting firms said, call the marketing guy and tell him to put the word evidence-based on every web page we have. Good, that's done. What's next?
Right, we're SEO, baby. We're SEO. We're optimized now. So you're right. I'm sure you're right. Became another brand.
But I would you think, well, what are we going to do with this? Well, one thing is that if we're going to just in your own work, I mean, but also if you want to sort of advance the state of management, pay attention to the evidence-based stuff. And as I said, let me give a big sort of shout out to the Center for Evidence-Based Management. because they're doing the real thing, right? They're not out there just pitching a product with the label evidence-based slapped on it. They're really doing their best to improve the field, but it's still a long road. And I think the reason it's a long road is we were talking about humans before and dual process theory and so on. I guess we're just getting the tiniest glimpses. We do a little study in a very narrow domain, and we get some kind of finding. But the complexity of what we're dealing with in real life is just way more complex than the research is not yet tuned up to deal with that kind of complexity.
Yeah, it's hard to replicate what really happens day to day, and especially, you know, I did have a story that was pointed out. One of the experiments you pointed out, I forget who or what the theory was, but you remember the one you mentioned in your book about people are passing the ball back and forth, and you're supposed to count how many times.
Oh yeah.
The gorilla walks through, right?
Yeah.
So I was in my career. This is way back when I was at Alcon, probably late '90s, and I went with a group of our senior leaders that I helped support in the HR role to a Wharton class, and that was pretty cool. Well, we were all in this auditorium, and they played that video, and they're like, count the bounces, see how many bounces you see these people. So these are all real competitive guys. They're all, you know, sales VPs and all that. And at the end, the instructor said, "So did anybody see anything weird there?" And I was kind of looking around because I was laughing as I was watching it. I go, "The freaking gorilla walked through?" And everybody's looking at me going, "What are you talking about?" And I couldn't believe it. They all thought like I had cheated or something, but I think it's because maybe I'm a little ADD and I couldn't concentrate so much on what they wanted me to. The gorilla walks right through this group of people, and people did not see him. That just blows me away. Stuff like that. I love it.
Yeah, and it shows you think, my gosh, humans are not quite what we think they are, because you'd say there's no way a human can miss that, you know, but we can and we do.
Yeah, it was 90% of that whole class. Yeah. Missed it. It was crazy. They actually made the instructor play it again so they could see it. This time they're looking for a gorilla, and they still didn't think. They were like, they showed a different clip, some gimmick. But when you wrote this book, were you writing this? You know, I mentioned at the beginning, I think, you know, you're writing a little bit to you, but who is the audience for this? Is this for anybody? Is it for everybody, or is it really targeted at people who are scientists and engineers or that type of thought?
Yeah, so so I've got sort of two audiences in mind, or maybe three. So the obvious audience is the person who's just curious, right? The person who be interested in reading a book on astronomy, and they might be interested in reading a book on management, but not because they said, "Oh, I need to learn some management tips," but they're interested in the field, and they just went, "Isn't this interesting?" Yep. You know, and the kind of people who would read. Yuval Noah Harari, right? Did you know that guy? He wrote *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus* and stuff. He's an Israeli historian, and he just writes interesting.
I read the entire catalog.
Yeah, well, so he just writes. I mean, so I don't want to compare myself to him because he's like just super brilliant. But of course, my book's a lot shorter than his book, so you get through it a lot faster. But the kind of people who just say, "You know what, I'm interested to understand why management hasn't progressed. So I'm interested in joining that exploration, just like I might be interested in the history of Egypt or the history of airplanes or whatever, right?" So that's one audience, and I say people who have an engineering science background are likely to have that kind of curiosity. I'll tell you the bigger aim, or the bigger goal, is that I would like some people to think, you know, this is kind of a national crisis or a national opportunity, where you say, here's something that the world isn't very good at. Maybe our country or our state can get better at this, and we'll have a competitive advantage because of it. Once we recognize we're not very good, and that what we've been doing to get better isn't working, right? That's important as well. The way we've been tackling this hasn't been making progress. So let's think about a new way to tackle it. We don't necessarily know the right way to tackle it, but we're going to go in here thinking that there's probably an opportunity if we're willing to tackle this a new way, or a couple of new ways. And you know what? I don't know if you remember back in the days when the Japanese cars started coming into North America, and in fact, Japanese manufacturing in general. And at whether this was a coherent national strategy or whether it was just sort of flowing from their culture, they realized that the quality, the way we were doing quality in the U.S. wasn't very good. We were happy with it. We thought that's fine. Look, a car's got all these parts. A few of them don't work very well. What the heck? That's fine. That's good enough. A 1 in 100 error rate. That's fine. Japanese said, I don't think that's I don't think that's the limit of what we can do. I think we can make massive improvements in quality, and they did, and they get the sort of 1 in a million. Now, you'd be right to point out that it was the Americans, of course, who came up with all that thinking, but it was the Japanese who said we can get competitive advantage from it. I can imagine, as I say, whether it's Singapore or Vietnam or perhaps some parts of the U.S. where people will say we can get an advantage if we're willing to admit that we don't know how to improve management, and we're going to set our goal to find out how to do it, to find out what's going to make for a better management science.
Well, I probably straddle the different groups that you're looking at, because I'm curious about interesting things. I'm interested in interesting things. I'll read a random book or article or whatever just because it looks interesting, basically like what you said. But to do something with it, I'm putting myself in applicability here. Is in HR, if you're an HR person, you're inside a company, and there are some of these ills, some that are in your company. And I think we're going to get to this, and I'll let you talk about this. But your organization has one of these disorders that you've mentioned, which are great. Do you think a book like yours helps somebody start to do some diagnosis and actually start to try to do some sort of protocol to heal it, to make some sort of progress with that?
Yeah, I mean, and the main thing it's going to do is it's going to expand your thinking. And it's going to take some things which maybe you suspected and say, you know what, this thing I kind of suspected, it's true. And I'll give you one conclusion I came to, and it'll be interesting to see how other people feel. But when you see an organization that is just absolutely ticking along perfectly, I think that's not I'll call it a stable state. That's not a natural state for an organization to be in, any more than it's a natural state for a human to be in top physical shape. You take your average human living their average life, they're not going to be in top shape. They're going to start getting fat and lazy. That's just how humans behave. Organizations tend towards becoming more fat and lazy, so they have all these different disorders that we've seen, right? And you'll have seen in the organization, like there are all these fiefdoms or sort of administrative bloat, all these kinds of things that you'll have seen. And I think when you read the book and you think, wow, there are a lot of these different disorders, and it is natural for organizations to fall into these disorders, then that maybe frames it a little bit differently, and that insight may help you sort of structure your thinking. So again, I'm not saying, well, here are the 3 ways to cure bloat, or here are the 3 ways to handle fiefdoms, but I am trying to help people deepen their thinking so that they can see more clearly the complexity that's ahead of them.
So you might be able to make some assessments. You might be able to identify it a little bit better, and then based on that, it's kind of incumbent upon us to maybe do the research. You mentioned this with the disorders. It reminded me of, and I hate that I can't remember the author, but it's a great book. It's From Barbarians to Bureaucrats. I'm not sure.
Okay, that sounds good.
And it's a great title, right? But it's about that life cycle of the company. And when you're young and hungry and everybody's just going 100 miles an hour, and let's say you succeed, eventually you get to what you're talking about. You get to that either that bloat or that things are cool now, let's be stable. And once you get there, you're going down, because you're no longer trying to improve or innovate. You're just trying to kind of hang out, and that's not a natural place to be.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll tell you. We were talking about who I wanted to read the book or who it's for. Is I'm really looking for the people who will take this and they'll say, okay, I get it. I have an understanding of why we haven't made progress in management or why we haven't been able to deal with these disorders. I'm going to. I now have some ideas about how we can tackle this in a more scientific way. So it's not that they're going to get the answers from me. It's that they're going to get the inspiration from me, or maybe the foundation or background from me that will encourage them to apply their own creativity. They'll be the ones who move the science forward. I want to be the cheerleader, saying, "Come on, let's get a next generation of people here who are going to look at what we've done for the past 50 years and say, you guys, nice try, but you haven't really built the foundations, but this next generation maybe will."
Yeah, it requires some people to step out there and do some things differently. I think we do need to do things differently with managers. I think if there's a catalyst for that, I interviewed Jessica Miller Morell last week, and she's a HR influencer. She does some awesome stuff for managers. And now that we have this COVID reentry, where everyone's considering how do we reenter either business, and it might not even necessarily strictly be about coming back to the office and things, but a lot of companies are now being able to bring people back and ramp up business and feel normal again. That's a new skill set for a lot of managers that they don't have in the past. They've got these hybrid workforces. They've got things that they weren't trained for. They just kind of handled. I mean, we put scotch tape and bubble gum